Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you all who have tuned in today. Welcome to our 38th panel discussion. Our topic today is reforming the education sector in South Sudan, a priority for a better future. My name is Dora Poniloro. I'm a social worker and a child welfare specialist. I'll be moderating this session today, and I'm very pleased to have with me a panel of experts in the field of education. I'll go on and present you them one by one. Because of the internet connection, some have not yet tuned in, but I'll start with Professor Julia Juani. She's a professor of educational leadership and policy studies. She's a former vice chancellor of Dr. Garang Memorial University of Science and Technology, chief executive officer and founder of Gender Equity and Women Leadership Program, an organization that empowers women in all fields of studies in South Sudan. Dr. Juani has served in various capacities under the government of South Sudan and has written extensively on justice and gender issues. She is passionate about women education and bringing more South Sudanese women into political leadership roles, and she is also a very powerful peace activist. You're very welcome, Dr. Julia. The next out is Dr. Kuyang Harriet Logo, who completed her doctorate degree at the Institute of Peace, Development and Security Studies, University of Juba. Dr. Logo is a lecturer of international law and international human rights at the postgraduate level of the same Institute of Peace and Development Studies. And she also teaches women and the law and child law at the College of Law in the same university. Logo is an independent consultant working on democratic governance, access to justice, and the rule of law with the United Nations and the international organizations, including academic institutions. And prior to becoming an academic and consultant, Dr. Logo served the UNDP in the capacities of rule of law analyst, program analyst of the rule of law, a cluster and access to justice specialist in the Sudan, South Sudan and Timor. You're very welcome, Dr. Kuyang Logo. The next out is Jane Kane Edward. She was born and raised in South Sudan. She's educated in Sudan, Egypt, and Canada. Dr. Edward received her PhD in Sociology of Education from the University of Toronto in 2004. She currently is an associate clinical professor and director of African immigration research in the Department of African and African American Studies, Fordham University in New York. She teaches courses on women in Africa, African history, women, power and leadership in Africa and African immigration in the United States. Edward's areas of research interests center on refugee and immigrant women's experience, human rights and education, gender, race, class, and representation. Also, gender issues in conflict and post-conflict situations. Edward carried out research work among South Sudanese refugees and internally displaced persons in Egypt, Uganda, and South Sudan. She is the author in the Journal of Sudanese Women Refugees, Transformations and Future Imaginings in 2007, and several book chapters and opinions that she has written. The next one out is Regina Akok. Regina is a teacher, a freelance journalist, completing her graduate work on women's and gender studies, focusing on women's war and displacement stories. Ms. Akok loves writing, cooking, dancing, poetry, enjoys friendship, and is committed to lifelong learning. She cares about social justice issues like racism, sexism, classism, and any other isms, as she states, and particularly women's advancement and working hard to make the world a better place for us all. The last one out is Ms. Evelyn Grace Ayotte. Evelyn is the founding academic registrar of Clark International University from 2007 to today's date. Prior to that, she worked in Uganda Martyrs University and held positions from administration to senior assistant registrar. Ms. Ayotte is a highly skilled, motivated, enthusiastic, and committed individual with over 20 years experience in higher education, especially startups, governance, management, and administration. You're welcome, Ms. Evelyn Ayotte. Now, how do we transform our education systems to ensure that every girl and boy can get the quality education they need to unlock their full potential and contribute to building a better South Sudan? Educating the population is crucial to the development of South Sudan. An educated population provides skilled workforce, which is key for facilitating competitions in the local economy and spurring economic development for the entire country. Education enables individuals to think critically, to solve problems, work together to resolve conflicts as well. Education not only equips a population with tools that are useful in everyday life, it presents hope for the future and lays the foundation for change. Educational reform implies questions of social population and of state regulation that are the key words in educational reform, education, and educational policies. These reforms are also on the political agenda of countries and involve international organisms, since education is a vehicle of development for social progress. A point of departure is that all reforms incorporate a certain level of consensus on the part of the actors involved, but that would be an ideal which rarely occurs, and then only when there is a national or regional vision. The objective of educational reforms is to fulfill the worldwide commitments made on the subject of the education. When speaking of the educational reform, reference is often made to changes and transformations in the scholastic system in relation to such factors as educational philosophy, student policy, curriculum, pedagogy, didactics, organizations, management, financing, and links with national development in this century. The consensus that the prime purpose of education is care and improve holistic education in early childhood, especially for most vulnerable and underprivileged children, and to guarantee access to free, compulsory, and high-quality education. The purpose of educational reform is to transform school structures with the aim of raising the quality of education in a country. For Africa in general, and South Sudan in particular, education is the key to long-term development, poverty reduction, and national building. Reforming and strengthening our education system is therefore crucial. Now, I'll go on and ask our panelists some questions. I'll start with Dr. Juani. Which level of education should be reformed immediately to improve the education system of South Sudan? Please provide a strategy that should be used, and should the issue of women be considered right as part of the reform? Why then? You're welcome.
Thank you very much. And hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. See everybody face. I think this is a very big topic that we are going to deal with today. And I think we will brainstorm and share ideas of how to reform education in South Sudan. Which level of education that should be reformed? First of all, let us ask ourselves where we come from. Education in South Sudan has been a colonial established education. Started with the missionaries who started the primary education and then later handed over to Sudan uh, which changed from the English pattern to the Arabic pattern. So those things has really affected our educational system in South Sudan. So to reform, I would rather focus on basic education, how we can start basic education. And to do basic education, the first area you should consider is the philosophy you want, the philosophy of education. What kind of a human being you want to develop? And, and I can give example of what I mean. Like Gandhi, when he started, who is the father of Indian independence, shaped education in India. So his philosophy was that we want to develop an Indian who is independent, hardworking, self-reliance. So for us in South Sudan, what kind of philosophy that we have so that we can develop our young people to become future people who can contribute to South Sudan. So I would say if we have to do the reform, we have to start from primary education, basic education. Because right now in South Sudan, we have different systems going on. We have people coming from East Africa with different philosophy. We have people from Sudan with a different philosophy of education. The Sudanese is much more Islamic education. So bringing in all these different type of education, in 2012, the Ministry of Education sat down and tried to develop a curriculum for education, from primary education to secondary education. These were really what kind of a human being we want to develop in South Sudan. And that curriculum is a very good curriculum in terms of documentation, what has been done in that curriculum. And I remember it was tested in Kenya, and most of the students failed because it was a very hard, strong uh, curriculum. And I think this is where we should start curriculum, which kind of human being we want to develop. And what they are talking about is that a self-reliance individual in the future, that could be a South Sudanese who could contribute to nation building and be able to solve problems that face them in life. I think this is where we can start our our reform in education. How is it for women in South Sudan? Because of the history, it were first the boys' school time, and when Islamic education came, also uh, Islamic mahat everywhere you go. Some of us, came back from that country. So for women, uh, the the enrollment, and for me, they should start if we can manage bring in kids to start from very that will be able to help the women in the future. And also to address to higher
I think Professor Julius having problems with the internet. Hello? I think Professor Julius is experiencing some technical internet problems. It's cutting. We can't hear her well. I think we'll just get back to her again. Yeah, from what I could get from Julia's presentation is that reforms have to start from the basic school. Basic education is very important, and having a philosophy of education that would only define ourselves as South Sudanese. And based from the history, she mentioned that our curriculum is kind of mixed, East Africa from the previous Sudan. So to be able to reform, to make reform in our schools, we have to start from the basic education. I think I'll go further and then let her come in again to continue. I'll go to Dr. Jane. And Jane, what does public institutions and individual experiences affect education and its outcome? Please, would you highlight on that?
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Good evening. It's morning here. Yeah, and this is a very good session focusing on the reform in the educational system in South Sudan. And the question about the public institutions, actually, one can answer it in different ways or multiple ways. And first, we have to identify what kind of public institutions actually we're looking at in the context of South Sudan. And since we're talking about education, then we have to think about the public institutions, educational public institutions like schools, public libraries, public universities, and other governmental institutions that are important in any given society. So the status or the standing of these public institutions affect education, whether it's a school building, whether it's a library, or any government institution also affect education and also determines the outcome of education. And these outcomes can be either positive or negative depending on the status of those public institutions. And I think there's so many studies out there that look into this situation and how it affects outcomes, educational outcomes. So the stronger and well managed and well funded public institutions often produce good results in terms of students' academic performance or the overall learning experiences or processes. And if we have like weaker public institutions, then that becomes a major problem also in any given society. And these weaker institutions actually can be seen in our context in South Sudan, for example. I've not been to South Sudan since 2013. So when I was there, actually, you can see how the public institutions, particularly the public schools, are not well managed. Like I went to the University of Juba. I studied at the University of Juba in the 80s, and it's still, people are still using the same facilities that we used during that time. So that actually becomes a major problem if these public institutions are not well funded and well managed. And if we take the individual experience, for example, based on the question that you posed, also It depends. And I'm not sure how I can approach this, but what I can say is that uh, the experiences of individuals actually depends on those who manage those institutions, whether a school or a library, and also what kind of experience those individuals have is very important. If we take the teaching profession, for example, it's very important for teachers or educators to have the knowledge or the skill actually to impart the knowledge to the younger generation in society. And also, they must have the training in their field of studies. If they're teaching math or history or geography, they have to have that knowledge so that they'll be able to teach the students. They also have to have regular professional development, and I think I learned this from my experience with my children in school. Like sometimes teachers have professional development sessions so that they can improve their knowledge and also acquire new form of knowledge to improve the educational system. So those are very important, and that's why to be able to actually produce that kind of person who is interested in the teaching and learning of children in society, you have to have stronger, well-funded and well-managed teachers training colleges or institutions, and that actually becomes very important. And I just want to bring an example of South Sudan. For example, in before South Sudan actually became independent, from Sudan, there are so many institutions actually that were managing this kind of professions, like the Meridi and Malakal Teacher Training Institutes, as well as Bakhtaruda Teachers Training Institute in Northern Sudan. And most of those institutions actually train teachers. And most of the teachers who graduated from those institutions actually teach in primary school or basic education, like primary school, intermediate, and secondary school. And the people who actually studied in those institutions actually became very good uh, uh, profe- uh, uh, professionals. Like my father's generation, for example, they're the one who attended, like teachers who graduated that time, who attended either Meridi or Malakal or even Bakhtaruda. Actually, most of them actually were very uh, good professionals, and they were well versed in both languages, English and Arabic, as well as their areas of studies. And that's actually very important to have those institutions so that will produce well trained professionals like teachers, for example. Unfortunately, if we look at our institutions today in South Sudan, that's not the case. Like so many things actually are not the same as it was in the past. There's so many reforms that are needed actually to bring the educational system in South Sudan to the level that you can say, okay, my children are studying in a very good school and in very better environment, learning environment, for example. So those are some of the things that I just want to mention in relation to this question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kane, for your input. And as you said, well-funded institutions, public institutions, and schools are very important for us to be able to give the education that our children need, and also training teachers, for teachers to have the necessary resources that are needed for them to be able to pass on the knowledge that they should do for the children. So thank you so much. I'll go further to Dr. Kuyang. For her to enlighten also on this topic. And I would say most of the public and private institutions in South Sudan are ill-funded, have poor quality of education, they lack equipped library, and barely meet the standards of universities, like for instance in East Africa. Do you think that political will and poor leadership are contributing factors to this? Dr. Kuyang, please. I think, Yeah, Dr. Koyang is experiencing some technical problems. Yeah, let's see. Okay, I think I'll just move further to Regina. Yeah. Is she back? Yeah. Okay. I'll just go to Regina. Although teachers are central to reform, they cannot be held solely responsible for achieving it. They need allies. Teachers alone cannot change the textbooks. They cannot install more sensible testing policies than are now in place. They cannot create administrative support systems by themselves, get the public to understand where reform is headed and why it takes time to get there, and raise the funds needed to repay or to pay for reform. Thus, school administration and educational policies are very well needed to support teachers. Teachers also need academic colleagues, scholars who are experts on relevant subject matter, like child development, learning, and educational potential of modern technologies. And they need the help and support of community leaders, business and labor leaders, and parents as well. For in the final analysis, educational reform is a shared responsibility. Now, Regina, what made you to continue to perform very well as a teacher? And please state and explain the motivational factors that motivated you in that. And should South Sudan adopt some of the factors you have indicated to improve the primary and secondary school? Please give us your input on that.
First of all, thank you for having me. There is nothing so great than being among these beautiful, intelligent women. I always believe that the future of South Sudan is on women, South Sudanese women. I'm so proud of each one of you. So what makes a good teacher? This is an excellent question. I will, and I don't mind talking about this for the whole show. To answer the question, I would say the great American educator, Dr. Rita Pearson, who worked as a teacher for 40 years. In 2013, she gave a phenomenal and one of my favorite TED Talk ever about education, about teachers. Pearson shared, I had one of my colleagues saying that they don't pay me to like the kids. They pay me to teach the lesson. Kids should learn it and I should teach it. Case over, case closed. End of the quote. Pearson, who did not only love teaching, but was passionate about it, was also funny and direct. She responded, kids can kids don't like kids don't learn from people they don't like. I agree, that is true. She talks about the value and importance of human connection in education, relationship, connection with student on a real human personal level. So somebody, I think, said one, no significant learning can take place without a significant relationship. All of us have been influenced by a teacher or an adult, a sister, a grandma, a coach, a brother, a big sister. We all have an adult who took care of us. Building on positive, healthy relationship in our classroom, school is about creating a safe environment for learning, where all kids or children, students feel respected, valued, encouraged to ask questions, make mistakes, and not be punished for making them, where they feel they belong, feel accepted, treated with dignity and respect. So she emphasized Pearson. I said I was going to quote her in that talk. She talked about teachers should seek understanding instead of being understood. That's mean. Understanding involves knowing your student, their names, their families, situation, poverty, interests, what they like, what they don't like, their learning style, what motivates them, what they care about, their strengths, areas that need growing. Sometimes knowing them may include knowing intimate and confidential information about them, such as their illnesses. And of course, for teacher to know that is to help them and make their learning uh, better. It's not to use it against them or something like that. Each child has something to offer when they come to our classroom, and it's the teacher's role to bring that out from them. Being safe in classroom include discouraging bad behavior like bullying, disrespect. Sometimes understanding relationship means taking care of simple things like apologizing to student and admit we made mistake or taught something wrong. Indirectly, you are teaching your child, student, integrity, to be in the world and tell the truth. It's all the above, the positive relationship, the sense of belonging that a good school, a good school culture provides, that give these children the comfort, confidence, competence, and motivation to learn. I'm saying that, and it looks like in because I'm teaching here, but this is possible, and we can do that. And I will talk about other things like in South Sudan. The skill needed to achieve this, uh, teachers should have communication skills, listening well, uh, good listening skill, not to what is said only, but to what is not displayed, what is not said, like worries, fear, insecurities of a child. This is called with itness in education. That's the ability to be attentive to what is around you. I'm a parent, and maybe some of you are parents too, and you know this, what I'm talking about. It's like having eyes everywhere. That's what I used to tell my son, having eyes at your back, so you know what is happening. So that's what teachers should have, is being aware of what is going on in the classroom, collaborating, team, to be open to learning from other teachers, educators, flexibility, and to work, because it's actually a changing environment, even from lesson to lesson, even from the same student, things change. So teacher have to have that, and that's happened, of course, through training, okay, and through working and through experience, because teaching is such a hands-on field. Okay, it's like experiment. You learn from it. You have a bad lesson today, you can reteach tomorrow, you will have another lesson. That's what's good about it, and that's come from reflection. It's very important for teacher to be reflective, and I don't think it's just teachers. It's, I guess, everything we are doing in life, we're supposed to be reflective, be patient, and is one of the skills that teachers should have. Good teachers also should be lifelong learners. They must love learning to inspire students. So um, I think Dr. Edwards talk about in school the professional development. These are very important things to develop on what we are doing, to read, to keep up with the new things. When it comes to South Sudan, I know we are facing a lot of different kind of things. Stability, we are working on it, I hope. And that's, I think that's where we start from there. When we have the stability, and then we have training, and then we have schools built, and not only in like major cities, to rural areas, and all these kind of things, I think make a good teacher. We connect these issues with I think I will have to. I was going to the next one, so I think I will have to stop here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Regina. You've really gave us an insight into how it is to be a teacher, and it's not only being a teacher, you should love it, and you should like being a teacher with heart and mind, building the necessary relationships, and be able also to teach in safe environment, create the safe and conducive environment to be able to tap into the children's potential, their full potential. So thank you so much. I see Kuyang is back. I think we'll just go back to the question. And it was, the question was, most of the public and private institutions in South Sudan are ill-funded and have poor quality education, and they lack equipped library and barely meet the standards of universities in East Africa, for instance. Do you think that political will and poor leadership are the contributing factors to this? Please give us your input on this.
Well, that's a great question, and I think that all of my fellow panelists have touched on really some of the issues that are affecting education. You know, Dora, just a cursory or mini assessment of education, especially higher education in the East African region or the United States or elsewhere, and then you juxtapose that with the situation in South Sudan, a lot is lacking. I mean, for me, when I started teaching there in 2013, I was really shocked about the lack of facilities, about the lack of funding. And most of the support that was provided to these institutions was provided by donors, you know, and not the entire faculties or colleges. I know very well that it was the College of Law that received a lot of funding from UNDP and IDLO, but the other colleges haven't received that kind of support. And for us, it's not just a lack of political will and the corruption. One thing that happened is you have to look at the transitions as well. My fellow panelists touched on that. The changes, the quick changes, sometimes ill-thought changes, you know, that kind of tend to occur because of the political situation, tends to affect the learners. The lecturers too. The lecturers can quickly do a turnabout and be able to catch up. But for the students, it's a big problem. And those are two things that are quick changes of curriculums, and then ill-funded, you know,
We have lost Dr. Koyang again. Yeah. There you are. Great.
My internet is really frustrating. But yeah, just to make the point is that there's a lack of political will. The priorities of our leadership is elsewhere. And that is very visible in the nature of our institutions of learning, is very visible even in the culture of our students. Regina talked about education not just being the academic aspect of it, but your environment. You find a lot of our students have to deal with other issues around conflict, poverty, and also, you know, troubled homes. And when they come to the class, they don't have that culture that you know, in Uganda, I went to Makerere, I went to the United States. You see that culture of competitiveness, of wanting to work hard, wanting to achieve the best that you can, is really lacking in our students. And really, just to re-emphasize your question, there's a political will. Today, I read that we are ranked as one of the most corrupt countries. by Transparency International, and I wouldn't be surprised. So we don't have our own resources that are put into these public institutions. These institutions are dependent on donors, and even the funding of the donor is really, really meager. And how do you have the largest public institution with no libraries? If they have libraries, the books are really, really old. Okay? The classrooms until recently didn't even have electricity. There's no internet. So how do you expect students learning in such environments to be able to compete with the rest of their colleagues in other places? And this is the question. There's no political will. There's absolutely no political will. There has to be a rethinking of the political will to ensure that there's a lot of funding that is brought into our public institutions so that tomorrow we can have children that are at the same world platform. Many of us have our children abroad. Most of the political leaders' children are abroad. Why? Because they know the quality is bad and they don't want to fix it. So that's really, really a something has to be done about it.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Logo. You've really highlighted the challenges that we meet as a nation in regards to higher education and in regards to meeting the needs of the children or young adults in education. It's not only the lack of political will, as you mentioned, there's lack of facilities, there's lack of instability, and again, depending on donors to fund our institutions of learning, that shouldn't be the thing. So it's a lot of work to be done, and I hope really that as we discuss this topic and that the political will be even more stronger, and we'll be able to have like a collective responsibility of tapping into it. Because again, the students cannot be motivated when all the facilities are not in place. Like when you don't have access to internet to be able to connect, to be able to get the necessary information that's in the internet, then you won't be motivated enough to compete even with the others. So we really are lagging behind in regards to this. So thank you for the input. I'll move further to the second question, and I'll go to Dr. Julia Juani. You've already highlighted a little bit on that, but then you were cut off the internet. So why is it still important for us South Sudan to reform the education sector, given all the challenges that have been mentioned now? And what are the benefits and likely challenges you think that would prevent the reform from happening?
Thank you very much. The internet is so frustrating in Juba. So I really apologize for that. Education is very important because it's one of the step for nation building. If you don't have, you don't bring up your literacy to the amount where the population understands the dynamics of the country, then it will be very you will have solving problems in the country. And that's one of the things we have in South Sudan. We have very low literacy here. Some other things, what benefit can people get from it? As individual, self-reliance. If you are educated, is one of the things that nobody can take away from you. The only thing that will deprive you will be when you die with that knowledge. So education is very important for this, even though it's not being taken as a priority in South Sudan. Towards the budget, the education budget is very low. If you look at it, it's almost like 2%, and it is for both general education and also higher education. So what will 2% do for education? So there is a challenge there. The teachers training is also a problem. If we can train enough teachers, that will bring knowledge to the classroom and be able to build those individuals who want to build, to be able to have self-reliance, then you also still have a challenge. Distance of education. Some kids walk miles, to go just, they get up very early in the morning, they will walk, 3 to 5 miles. By the time they get to school, they're very tired. Maybe that's tomorrow, they will not come back. So distance to education is very important. If we have a budget that could be able to build more schools in the locality where communities are and have more teachers who are trained, then we'll be able to tackle the challenges of education, and will also benefit the community, because if they have more education in that educated in that community, the community become more prosperous. Uh, Infrastructure, there are no. If you come around here in Juba, the only thing you see are the former schools who were built by a boot, 1962 buildings. Some of the buildings today, they still have the same zinc, you know, roof tile of the 1962. And sometimes, it breaks our heart to see such a situation. So infrastructure is very important, and particularly for girls, students. If you don't have good toilets where they can refresh, is also a challenge. Then they will not be able to come to school when they have their monthly, challenges with the young women have. So these are some of the challenges that face us. Before we get the benefit, we have to address these challenges. The other one is the Parents Teachers Association. Some of these are formed, but they are not function. They don't function. So we need to educate the parents to understand that educating a child, it is not only the classroom, but also involvement of the parents from home. When they go back to their home with their homework, are the parents looking at it, or they just carry that handbag back to school, and tomorrow morning you put it back behind the child and push them. So if I lost all the papers, even the papers you brought to school, the parents have not seen. So parents, student association need to be improved, because it is the responsibility of the community also. So all those things are part and part. The benefit would be for building our nation. The human resource would be strong, and we'll be able to have, a country viable of individuals who can address challenges and build a better nation for South Sudan. I think these are some of the things. For me, as individual, it is also a support. Friends, people who see you, your dedication, when you commit yourself, to what you want to do, and you find people who are helping you, you will be able to succeed. So I'm also urging some of our women, if you have 2 young girls that you can mentor and bring them up with you, will be also a benefit to this country, and also to increase the number of women. So this is what I do all the time. Whenever I go anywhere and I find female in there, that I just hit the landmine. I say, this is my time for me to make an impact on them, so we can all benefit. Our numbers are very low in South Sudan. Women who are educated, we have not yet even start to do the database, so that we know who is where and who is who, so that we can be able join hands and be able to build our nation through the support we can give to our young women who are coming behind us. So benefits are so many. You can count them one by one, but for me, the benefit is really that I got an education supported by my parents, and also the teachers who helped me in the classroom, plus the friends who pushed me harder to go. Now I have this knowledge and I'm sharing with other women in South Sudan. That is a big benefit uh, to our people. I can stop here and then somebody can pick it up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Juani. And I think you have highlighted on important issues, the importance of education. We have seen it in you, we see it in all of you, the panelists here, and the importance of also investing on it. As you mentioned, we need to have budget in place to be able to set up reforms. We need to have trained teachers. The infrastructure has to be in place, something that is not at the moment. And we have to have functioning teachers association. And it is also, as you reminded us of, it's a collective responsibility. In our various capacities, if we can be able to help others get educated, be able to tap into the country's educational system by any means, that could also be of help. So thank you very much. I'll move further to Dr. Kani. Do you think that the expansion of higher, further adult and continuing education can reform the education systems of South Sudan? How would that be? And please, if you can suggest a strategy that could help bring the reform quickly. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you again. And I think this question actually is most of the points that I wanted to cover actually are covered by Koyang, by Regina, and by Julia. Yeah, but my answer, the shortest answer to this question is yes. I think it can be expanded. But to expand something, you have to have the basis of how to expand that. And that basis actually depends on the points that Julia and Koyang just mentioned, the difficulties that the educational system in South Sudan is facing, whether in terms of funding, in terms of lack of infrastructure, and other important aspects like the political will, good governance, because you have to, education cannot happen in a vacuum. It needs a safe social environment where the student can learn and also those who are educating those students can also function well. So my shortest answer is yes, you can expand those educational institutions, whether higher education or adult education or continuing education, because those are very important. If we take the adult education, for example, in South Sudan, the majority of adults actually are not literate, whether in English or in Arabic. And in the national languages, maybe they can speak the language verbally, but they can't write actually the national language. So if we have a strong adult education, actually that will be helpful to train those who maybe miss their basic education, whether primary, secondary education. They can go to adult classes so that they can do that. And I think the churches also can play a role in South Sudan, whether the church or the other faith institutions like the mosque, for example, they can also play a role in imparting knowledge to uh, uh, adult who wants to train. And in terms of the continuing education, actually, is very important because that has been there actually in Sudan when South Sudan was part of Sudan. If we take the Juba University, for example, they had the colleges, the regular colleges, and then there was community studies, I think. And that's a form of continuing education. And in that institution, actually, they bring people, professionals who have been working in the government to come and continue with their education. Also, in the regular colleges like College of Education, College of Social and Economic Studies, they also bring people who have been working in the government to improve their skills, like teachers who are teaching in primary school or secondary school or in intermediate school, for example, were brought to the University of Juba, to the College of Education and continue with their studies. And instead of when they finish, instead of going back to, to primary school, they can teach in high school. So all these things actually can be done, but it needs resources. Everything goes back to resources. You have to have the funding necessary so that you'll be able to expand this institution, because if you want to bring more adult students, for example, then you need space for those adults to be able to study. If you want to continue with the continuing education, for example, then you have to expand the universities, for example. I have not been to the other universities in South Sudan. The only university that I have seen is the Juba University because it's in Juba. I didn't go to WOW to see the other universities in those areas, so I don't know the status of those universities. So the bottom line, to be honest with you, all these expansions in higher adults and continuing education will help in the reform of the educational system in South Sudan. But to do that, you have to have all the necessary ingredients that most of the other panelists actually mentioned. Without that, you will not be able to reform uh, the educational system. And I think I just want to give the example of the regional government after the signing of the peace agreement, for example. In the period between 1970s, early 70s and 1980s, for example, the regional government actually invested and promoted public education. And I always emphasize public because I'm a product of public education. My children are a product of public education, you know? So I emphasize the public education because it was very important at that time. And even today, not everybody can afford to pay school fees for their children, you know? A poor guy in Juba or in Wow or in Upper Nile, they can't afford to pay for their children. They need these public institutions. So that at that time, actually, the public schools were promoted and invested for. And I think my generation actually went to school. I didn't pay a penny for my education from primary up to university. When I was at the Juba University, actually they did a survey of all the students at the university. They wanted to know whether the families of those students can actually pay the school fees for their children. And the majority of the students, actually, their parents couldn't afford to pay even $5 or $50 for their education. So the government actually decided to say, okay, education is free for everybody, you know. And then when you finish your studies, you are given transportation to go back home. Today you can't do that. So and I think all of us who are here, we are successful because we had the resources available so that we'll be able to go to school. Without that, we cannot be able to do it. So, in conclusion, actually, the expansion is good, but it requires a lot of changes, whether those changes are political, economic, and other aspects related to Sudan. There's a buzz now, people wanted to promote private education. We cannot, South Sudan cannot progress with private education. The only option for South Sudan and South Sudanese younger generation, especially girls, is the public education institutions. And maybe later people can think about private education, but I don't think private education is the option for South Sudan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jane. I think that gives us a chance to move further to Evelyn. Evelyn is going to give us some important factors that South Sudanese or South Sudan, should consider when reforming the education sector, especially in post-secondary school. Evelyn, welcome.
Thank you very much. I want to apologize for joining in late. Like I'd explained, I was traveling, but I'm happy that I have followed the discussions. Now, when you talk about educational reform, like all the colleagues have said, I think it starts with each of us. We've had issues in the country. We know the political situation. What do we need to do? My colleagues have talked about the teachers, the pay, the training. If you don't pay a teacher well, what motivates him or her to go to school? If a teacher goes to school and there's nothing to teach with, how will they be able to manage and encourage the kids? So I think one of the things that the government in South Sudan needs to do, or us who are in the education sector need to do, is how do we equip the people that we work with? How do we make their lives better and comfortable? Yes, we need infrastructure to be there. We are all struggling with internet now. So you can imagine what it means like for the education sector where the internet is on and off. We need to invest in infrastructure. We need to look at taxes. Government needs to look at taxes for education. Because sometimes you cannot build, it's expensive for you to bring material and start to build. If you do not have the local funding, how will you manage to run the system? So I think the government needs to look at education as a priority, because beyond that, then the rest will follow. So we need tax evasion, whether possible. We need people to be able to reform the teacher training schools. We need to train the teachers better. We need to be able to make their lives comfortable. I need to afford to buy food for my child at home so that I can go and teach in school and be comfortable that someone is eating, that I've left food on the table. So we need to look at the better pays. We need to look at support locally. How can we use the local materials that we have? That means that things have to be made accessible. If you don't have a road to reach that school, a kid probably has to either walk through roads that are impassable. Even the parent cannot drop the kid to school. So the reforms really that the government of South Sudan needs to do is to look at how can we make life bearable. For me, I want to look at it from the human perspective. Because if you make life better, okay, look at our money now. Will you pay the teacher a full sack to make the teacher comfortable? The value of our money has gone down. And then we are competing with the East African region. I mean, I live in Uganda and I work in Uganda, and we are struggling with the same as a country in Uganda. So you find that we have been closed for 1 year because of the COVID. And I was telling colleagues yesterday that many, many teachers are going to run away from education because they've realized that they can live without teaching. They can live without having to go to school. Teachers are now coming to our homes to teach our kids. You pay a teacher, he comes for 2 or 3 hours, he's making much, much more money than he can make for a whole month, waking up and going to school and teaching the kids. So these are issues that we need to deal about. We need to start with the human person. Look at the teacher in totality. Look at the kids in totality. Our curriculum. How good is our curriculum? How is it marketable? Dr. Kulang said, all our kids are not studying in South Sudan. People are in Nairobi, people are in Uganda, in the UK, in the US, and everywhere, because the curriculum is holistic. I know that when my kid goes there and comes back, at least they've gotten something. What does our curriculum teach us to do? Are we job seekers? Are we looking at the output? Because really, if a child goes to school and comes back worse than they went, what is the reason for someone to take their child to school? So I think we need to focus. We need to turn back and say, I was happy when Jen said, in their generation, they studied for free. The infrastructure was there. The facilities were there. The support was there. All you needed to do was to make sure that you had a kid or someone who was keen to go to school. But right now, the motivation is not even there with the children. Because how do you reach the school? Okay? I have had children or cousins I talk to, and they say, we don't even understand, because there are people who have not been to school and they are better off. They make more money, their lives are comfortable. You'll go to school, you'll spend donkey years, and you'll find that what you have and what you can show people that I'm an educator cannot even be weighed. So, Dora, for me, I think that if we start with the human person, if we look at how do we improve my situation as an individual, how do you make the life better? And then infrastructure-wise, internet is one of them, because now we are global. So we need good internet. We need the library as we're informed. If you look at Jamajuba and there is no library, what does that mean? It's useless to go to the university. It's useless to go to school. Let's look at our primary schools. I went to Juba Model Primary School. And recently, as alumni were saying, look at the school. Look at the state of that school. The buildings are dilapidated. The classroom, I looked at the floor and I said, do kids actually study in this environment? We need to make the environment better. If government can give us subsidies, for example, if government can build schools, because now we are beginning to rely on private schools. So if government can invest more and make the public schools and the public facilities much more inviting, much more habitable, I think the educational reform will start. I don't want to repeat what my other colleagues had already said, but I just thought I should make this comment. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. This is so profound. You have given many good recommendations that need to be in place for us to be able to make those reforms really. And it's just so profound looking on how many challenges that we really face as a nation to be able to reach the standard of either East Africa or other countries, and to be able to motivate our children actually to go to school. And those teachers that have been teaching, nevertheless, to even lose their jobs, because now if they find out that they're not being paid well and they can find other alternatives of working, then we are also losing good teachers. So it's really a lot to be done. So thank you so much for highlighting on that, Evelyn. I'll still continue with you, and now it's in regards to universities. I recently read an article about Rwanda, where many students that had graduated from a certain university, their certificates were being taken back because the university was not accredited, and what they achieved from the university was not acknowledged. So, Evelyn, what is an accredited university, and what happens if someone completed his or her education in a university which is not accredited? Why is it important to complete a higher learning in an accredited university? So please give us your input. Oh, I see Evelyn has dropped out, so I think we'll get back to her. I'll go to Dr. Harriet. What strategies should South Sudan use to improve its education sector? I think you have mentioned on that, but if you can highlight more on the strategies in regards to gender equality, and why do you think it's so important? You are on mute, please unmute yourself.
Education at all levels is very interlinked, okay? So when we talk about gender equality, we talk about more younger girls coming in through the education system. We're talking about so many factors, so many variables that have to be improved if you look at the situation in South Sudan. From the time that we took off as a state, a lot of things were wrong. And now when we talk about issues of gender equality, bringing in more women, Professor Julia and Dr. Kani had perhaps even touched on some of the disparities in terms of the numbers of, boys and girls. All of those ratios are very low from the lowest level. And I always say that these things start from the family. I teach a course on women and the law. You know, the very foundations of our subordination as women starts from the family. It doesn't start from another institution. It basically starts from the family. That's where it starts. The boys are more important. The girls are not so important. And these are the areas where the change must begin. So it starts from the family. Two, there has to be incentives. One, incentives to encourage girls to stay. Incentives to encourage girls to manage the difficulties that come with learning. Learning is not very easy, to be honest with you. So when you look at contexts like South Sudan, places like South Sudan, my panelists had touched on, the dilapidated infrastructure. So that, we girls, to be honest with you, Dora, we tend to give up so easily. So if the infrastructure is not very conducive, if you have to walk for long distances, you have your house chores, that's why you see a lot of girls dropping off. So all of these factors have to be corrected to keep the girl going at all of the lower levels. And when they reach the higher level of learning, for my own experience, if you look at affirmative action to ensure that there's gender equality, it is only at the political level. It is only at the political level. It doesn't look at affirmative action in other areas, and education is one of the most important areas. And I keep saying this from the very first panel that we had, that in Makerere, for instance, where I went for my first law degree, there was an affirmative action, 1.5 points for just being a girl, you know. And in our institutions, it is not there. If you look at cultural factors and some of the social problems that a girl goes through, she may finish her high school, but she only has, she's missing the points by and that's really difficult. So we need that. So we really fall below the global, you know, numbers in terms of gender equality. But I think something can be done in terms of having free marks, not really free, but well-deserved marks, to make sure that there are more girls, and then also to make sure there's some funding to improve all of the infrastructure, to ensure that families are also encouraging their own girls. I've spoken, you know, Professor Julia touches on, you know, we need to encourage little girls. We try, but when we do that, sometimes the problems are not even the institutions, but it is in the family. So there are so many other factors that are at play that really keep the girls dropping off. It is family, it is the institutions, it is also at the institution of higher learning to ensure that there's affirmative action in place so that, you know, these girls can compete. Another thing also, I tend to see that even in the higher institutions of learning, for instance, my law class has 7 girls at the most since 2013. And then for my postgraduate classes, it's even 1 or 2. So what does that tell you? That even when the girls are in these institutions of learning, they need to be encouraged to participate, to speak. Most of them keep quiet. You know, they are in the law class, but they're just silent. So when we talk about equality, it's not just numbers. How many of these girls are participating in the class? Sometimes we tend to probe them, you know, just speak, you know, because they're surrounded by men. So the environment as well at the higher institution needs to be conducive to encourage the girl to try to speak. Sometimes we, the lecturers, we try to prompt them, yes, yes, that's good, that's very nice, but there's much more that, and I think my paper, Professor Julia, is coming out about some of the, you know, that equality is not about the numbers, but if the girls are coming in, there's need for an environment for them to be able to speak. So there's a lot at all of these levels that needs to be done. But I think also really, Dora, part of the biggest problem is really in the family. It really lies in the family. So when we talk about equality, we need to also look at equality in courses. You know, you find very few women in medicine, in law, in education. So equality also has to be in terms of bringing more women to study engineering, law, medicine, education.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kuya. That's a really good input into having gender equality in the education sector. And as she mentioned, it starts from the families. And again, I think it also has to do with the attitude in our societies and communities, how we perceive women and where women's place should be. So that's a big responsibility that lies on the families to encourage their children to be, especially girl children, to be in school, and also getting the affirmative action into the institution of learning so that more gender female are represented in all the various fields of education. So thank you so much, Kuya. I'll go back to you, Evelyn, and your question was in regards to universities. What is an accredited university, and what happens if someone completed his or her university education from a university that is not accredited, and why is it important to complete a higher university in such a higher education or learning in a university that has been accredited? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dora. Now, a university that is accredited must be a university that has been registered. I will use the example of Uganda, and I'm sure that goes across to South Sudan as well. Now, for higher institutions, you have the Ministry of Education, but again, you have the National Council for Higher Education. A university is accredited when it meets the basic requirements. Basic requirements means you have the right facility, you have the right environment, you have the right lecturers. If it's anything to do with learning is adequate because you have a checklist that you must use. All your checklist is tick. Then a university is accredited and you're given a license to operate. When you're given a license to operate, it means that you are now recognized worldwide because we are training students who are not only in one place. So the university, for example, you find that a student wants to go and study outside Africa. The university must be approved and known, and you must be given a number. There's a number that you're identified with, that if anyone now comes and checks, for example, I work at Clark International University. If you click Clark International University on the internet, you must find that it is accepted and it's licensed to operate. Why? Education now is a business. It has become a business that everyone has realized that the fastest way to make money is to start an institution of higher learning. Because there are many kids, as we go from one level to another, there are many people that are redundant. There are many people that are stranded. They need to go to school. So many people have come up with all sorts of institutions that are training. You will find that someone who is an undergraduate is teaching a master's student. That is not acceptable. So a university must go through different inspections. You must be accredited by the National Council for Higher Education if it's the Ugandan case. I know in Sudan, we also have the National Council for Higher Education. You need to be accredited by the professional councils, especially if you're doing the medical courses. You have medicine, you have the law society. So all those people must recognize you as operational. They must come and see what you have. People like to be accredited in other, you want to go outside the country. I've seen that people check, is your university actually recognized? If I pick now and call, can I be told where it is? Because there are places where the university or the school is just a building. With a teacher, there's a box number, but there's no physical address that you can go to a building and see this is what it is. Or it is moving from one place to another. Today I'm in this location, the next day I'm shifting to another location. Now, if you go to such a university or such a school that is not accredited, it is as good as, pouring your water and watching it flow. Because you will study, you will pay your fees, but at the end of the day, especially if you want to do postgraduate studies, and they check back, you are not recognized. It's like you have not gone to school. Yes, you've got the knowledge, but the paper that you have is irrelevant. The paper that you're using is, and basically it comes back to recognition. You will, a university can be closed, yes, because you have to be given parameters and criteria to go through before you get the final accreditation. Now, if along the way your university has a problem or your school has a problem, even the ministry will know that once upon a time there was a school A, but because of A, B, C, D, there is record, there is reference. There's a point where someone can say, okay, it used to be this and it's now this. I have changed my university name in the last 2 years, but people will still know it by the previous name. And when I'm going to the internet and searching for recognized universities in the world, it will read this in bracket that. So we have to be very, very careful. Which university do I go to? Which school do I send my kid to? And that's not only in Africa. I've had these cases in America where someone has gone to a school. You find that someone has done a degree, an undergraduate, a master's, a PhD in a period of 6 years. They have all this qualification. Then you're trying to check what kind of university is this, and it does not exist. We should be careful even now with online universities. There are very many people who are now coming on online studies because that's the way to go. But you must go beyond and ask questions. You should be able to check, contact the ministries, contact the councils. Do you have this university? Unfortunately, because we are desperate for school, because we as parents want to send our kids out of this country, we don't bother to get the details. But unless that university must be recognized, there must be a certificate of recognition that someone must ask and say, can you give me a copy of your recognition or your copy of the license, so that you know that that university is licensed. If they don't have a copy of the license, it could be by the Ministry of Education, because some countries, universities are still directly under the Ministry of Education. But for us now, because you have the professional councils, even the courses that you run must be accredited. So your curriculum must be accredited. It's not a matter of just having a university accredited, because I can be accredited, but then my courses are not approved. My courses must meet the basic requirements. The admission criteria must be clear. The course outcomes must be clear. So this particular program alone must be accredited, and then the university must be accredited. So we should not only focus on the bigger picture of the university, but we must also look at the courses. We've had students, for example, who have come to a university that is accredited. They've done a course, but that course itself is not accredited. So your degree is useless. Your degree is irrelevant. Your degree is unrecognizable. You have to start afresh. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for a thorough explanation of what an accredited university is. And I think that's good information for us parents or anyone who's willing to register to university or want to take a course. So maybe Evelyn can also be available for some questions if you would like to check out before registering for a course in university. So thank you so much. I'll move further to our next question, and I'll go to Dr. Edward Kani, sorry. What is the difference between educational sociology and sociology of education? How does it apply to South Sudan? And can education sociology improve the education sector of South Sudan? Please explain it to us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dora. And I think this is a very complex and interesting question. Yeah, just the simplest thing is that I don't think there's any distinction between the word educational sociology or sociology of education. I think they mean the same thing if we go to the definition of it. It's just the semantics that people just use, educational sociology or sociology of education. So, and if we look at the definition, for example, many people, especially scholars who are social scientists, see sociology of education as a field of study, and it means actually the use or application of sociological theories, methods, and other discoveries to the administration and instructional processes of formal education. And I think we have to distinguish that, because there's different forms of education. And this actually applies to formal education, where you go to school and then you learn, unlike the other informal education that we learn from home, like the socialization process that starts from the family and then the community and then other traditional institutions. So, and I think the simplest understanding of sociology of education actually is the fact that you apply sociological theories to the study of or to the educational processes, particularly in formal education. And I think the linkages between sociology and education is the fact that sociology deals with the study of societies and social relations within a given society. And education always takes place in a society where you educate individuals. So this actually the connection between sociology and education. It has to do with people. It has to do with society, and the relationship between individuals. And this relationship actually can happen within the family as well as within the school environment. And that's the most important things that I can say about the sociology of education. So seeing the study of the sociological processes involved in any educational institution actually draws those linkages between education and society as a whole, and also the interpersonal relationship that occur within that educational institution, whether that is a university or a school. And if we bring that to our context in South Sudan, for example, this is very important. And I'm sure even in our present time, maybe this kind of learning process is still happening in South Sudan. But I always refer back to before independence of South Sudan, because that's what I know a lot, because today actually it's very difficult to know. I don't live there now, and I don't know what's happening in the institutions there in South Sudan. But if you look back into the pre-independence of South Sudan, sociology of education is actually one of the field of studies in the College of Education at the Juba University. For example, I graduated, as I mentioned earlier, I graduated from Juba University College of Education. And at that time, actually, the sociology of education is one of the field of studies that was taught for those who were studying in that college to become teachers in high schools or in secondary school, as they call them in South Sudan. This field of study also is taught in relation, in conjunction with educational planning, educational administration, philosophy of education. I think Julia mentioned that earlier in her presentation. So all these fields actually are very important for any teacher to become a successful teacher in the classroom. And that's how this is very important, the sociology of education in any school or higher education institution of higher learning, actually. So to improve the educational sector in South Sudan, because we're talking about reform, there's need actually to incorporate all these fields of studies into the educational system. It's very necessary, so that those who are trained to become teachers are qualified in those fields, so that they'll be able to impart the knowledge that is needed to improve the educational sector in South Sudan. But I still go back to the fact that having good teachers actually is not the only solution. You have to have the social environment that I mentioned earlier, whether that social environment is within the school infrastructure or within the family as well. Those are very important. And you have to have a very good curriculum that actually can allow students to learn in that environment. And I just want to shift to add to what Kuyang actually mentioned earlier in terms of the gender equality. In terms of girls' education, I think we need to also look at the curriculum. What does the curriculum say about gender equality? And also the teaching methodologies that are used in the school, whether those methodologies are actually reflective of the gender component of the society. And there's a tendency in South Sudan, in particular, when I was there in 2013, and also among South Sudanese in general, that they always tend to conflate gender and women. They see it as the same thing. So if you can't distinguish between women and gender, then that becomes a major problem in many aspects, actually. So for this question, actually, just that's what I can say. And I think it's very important to incorporate the sociology of education in the courses that are taught for the teaching profession, like what we went through. For example, we learn about the sociology of education, philosophy, administration, educational planning, and also teaching methodologies, both in theory and in practice. Is very important, because if we don't have that, then you'll not be able to be a teacher like Regina Akok in public schools. Yeah. Or myself, or Julia, or Kuyang, for example. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Edward. I think that gets me back to Regina, and as a teacher, Regina, what strategy do you think South Sudan should use to harmonize its curricula? And please give us some practical examples from where you are. You are on mute. Please unmute yourself. We can't hear you. Yeah. Could you please? Yeah.
Okay, so I will go to question. Okay, 4. What strategies do we need for South Sudan should use for curriculum? I think many of you have touched on really good things, and you asked me also to give example from. I'm a teacher here in Canada, so I will first give example as a teacher in Canada and the curriculum, and then I will go to South Sudan. Canada has, of course, these are established countries, 100 year and 50 or 200 years, something like that. Their education, there is no comparison. And also, I appreciate in the beginning everything that each panelist said, and I just want to go back before I talk about the curriculum. It's really important to have public school, public institutions. This is what we have here in Canada. This is why we are educated, as Jane has mentioned, because that's before the war. Even during the war, there are people in Sudan who moved or were displaced in northern Sudan. They were able to go to those public school. Like I can't see and I can't imagine having to start with private school in southern Sudan. I can't imagine that. Like, I don't know. I think 99.9 of people cannot afford private school. Private school can come later, as you mentioned. About the curriculum, so I said I was going to give example of Canada. I teach in public school, both public school and Catholic school. So Canada has a well-funded system. It's their system of education is managed the curriculum provincially. So like in Saskatchewan. So I follow the curriculum of Saskatchewan. If I move to another province, I will have to be certified to get a certification and give a license for that province. And then I will be able to teach in that province, like in Alberta or BC. However, federal government oversees education. Education standards remain consistently high throughout the country. That's about Canada. I saw something. Yes, we can get inspired. That's, I think I said something that we don't need to get inspiration from the West. I saw something about, and I'm not sure, like I found something that there is a curriculum that started by the Ministry of Education in South Sudan, Science and Technology. It was developed in 2015. And my understanding, that is just in paper. When I look at that, it looked like a great one. It just need implementation. And then we can build on that. So there were 4 keys that were this curriculum, or this the idea of having a curriculum in South Sudan touch on, which is like good citizenship of South Sudan, successful lifelong learners, creative and productive individuals, and environmentally responsible members of society. And this what we have here that's what we have here in Saskatchewan curriculum. So if we have that, that will be great. But I think all of you have, many of you have touched on that. And I mentioned that in the beginning, like the stability, infrastructure. Infrastructure is the big thing, is broken. We need to start. We don't have even schools yet. and we don't have schools in many areas. We don't have school in rural areas. And so if we started, and this would start with funding, okay, and resources, and that start with the government being responsible for that, and then all other communities and all other sectors that are working to help with that too. So I will read part of what I found. This is what it says. The curriculum is competency-based and integrate life skill and peace education, gender, human rights, environmental awareness into school subjects. The curriculum includes academic and co-curricular activities to provide a variety of experiences for learners, as well as designed to impart essential life skills that are important for peace building, cooperation, tolerance, identity, appreciate cultural diversity, and engage learners to enhance their overall positive cognitive, psychological, their attitude for transformation. If this is real there in paper, sitting there in paper, and it's not implemented, that is too bad. But I hope we will get there, like to work on that one. In the beginning, I mentioned something about what makes like teaching works. I talk first on and some of you and many of you like touch on that, on human, the connection and relationship. But also we need these facilities, and we need the curriculum to translate into real life. We need the curriculum to translate into real life. We talk about this issue that are, instead of just exporting, we are not part of the Sudan, North Sudan anymore. We are not, yes, we are from South Africa, but we can just take a curriculum from another country and apply it. That's why I understand why we have here the education is managed by a province. We can't do that yet in South Sudan, to start to manage education by a province or by a state. Okay, we use a state for that matter. We can start yet with a unified curriculum and focus on that. So for example, how do I translate knowledge into real life? If I'm reading a novel, students need to know why they are reading that novel. What is it teaching you? It has to do about them as kids at different levels. You start to teach those great things that we really need so much in our society. Culture of inclusiveness, okay? Culture of gender and human rights, culture of, we already have, as South Sudanese, we already have, although we don't believe in that, we already have one thing. Although we don't like to, or we might not know that we have a strength, which is a sense of community. We take care of each other. We take care of our brothers or our sisters. We can take that to school system, to a curriculum. So I want to give you an example. So I'm a teacher. I teach English language art and art education, like drama and dance. So if I ask a student, for instance, to create dance composition that express perspective and raise awareness about a topic of a concern to youth, okay, investigate. So it's not, they are not just dancing, they are dancing, but they are also exploring these identity issues, these social issues that we face as South Sudanese community. So develop informed conclusion about the importance of leadership skills and health promotion in healthy decision making. That's in health class. Math, for example, why am I teaching math? The student need to know, why is it relevant? Yes, math is relevant. It's relevant in your life, in your daily life. It's relevant When you go shopping, it's relevant. You're doing math when you are cooking. You're doing math when when you distributing food, okay, to people. You know what amount of. So that's why math is relevant. When students know that, that's make our curriculum really relevant, and this is very important for education. I think I will stop here.
Oh, thank you so much, Ms. Regina. I think that also reflects on what Dr. Jane has earlier spoken about in regards to sociology of education, relating our education and all the things that children learn into the societal issue. So that's really very great input. Thank you so much. I'll move further to Dr. Harriet. I think she's experiencing some problems with the internet. So I'll just go further to Dr. Jane. What do you think from your experiences in the Western world? What do you think did the Western world reform do to its education sector? And if you can kindly give us some practical examples from your field.
Okay, thank you, Dora. You always give me so many difficult questions here. I have to, yeah. But what I just want to know is, I just want to touch on what Regina actually talked about before I go to my question. Is about the public education and the public institutions in Canada. Actually, I am Canadian and American at the same time. So I lived in Canada for almost 7 years, and my children actually started school in public schools. And I think that's the most important thing that South Sudan needs, actually. I want to emphasize that again and again, because there's a tendency now where people wanted to shift to private schools as if everybody can pay for their children's education. So in terms of the Western world and how they did actually to reform the education sector, that's a broad question that I cannot cover in a very short period of time. But what I can say is that um, everything has to do with educational reform goes back to resources, and whether that's financial resources or other resources or even human resources. Those are very important if you want to do any reform. So now I'm living in the United States. I'm teaching in one of the institutions in the United States, but not a public university. It's a private university. I'm sorry to say this. But in terms of the public educations in the United States, for example, um, it has to do with funding, management, and administration of the school system, the public school system. So in the case of the United States, for example, according to the US Department of Education, the federal government actually contributes a certain percentage of the budget to the public schools in the United States. And then for the other part of the funding for students in public schools in the states, then the states actually are mandated to fund schools in their states. And it's similar to Canada, actually. The only difference is that Canada calls their states provinces. Canada has provinces, here we have states. So the level of funding is two. Federal government gives a portion of the budget to the public schools in the states, but the states are mandated to also fund the school system in the United States. And the level of educational reform, or the level of the educational institutions in each state, depends on taxes that the people who live in that state pays. You know, the richer the state, the better schools they have. And like New Jersey, I live in New Jersey, and New Jersey is one of the most states that has high taxes, in particular property taxes. We pay a lot of property tax. And this property tax actually go to fund the local schools. Like I live in a small township. So our township, the property owners pay taxes to the district, And then much of the funding actually goes to the educational board in that district. And the best funding you have, the best public schools you have in any state. So you cannot generalize the reform to the whole of the country, but you can measure that state by state. And that's the most important thing. And also in the US, actually, the states also, the public school systems actually provide this professional development, and that's very important. And I have to repeat that because if you want to improve the public sector in South Sudan, then you need also to improve the professional development of the teachers, whether in primary schools, intermediate school, or high school. And that's very important. And also, I think the overall infrastructure in the country is very important, because if you do, here they have buses, like it depends on the distance between the school and where the child lives. If the distance is so far, public schools always provide buses for these children to go back and forth to school. Without that transportation, then it's going to be very difficult for children to attend school. So in South Sudan, I think people have to think about accessibility in terms of improving the public education, whereby the school must be close to the students, because majority of our parents in South Sudan are not, they don't have access to cars and all that. And if the government can provide public school buses, that will be good. Because I was in 2013, I mentioned that earlier, I went to Lobonog actually. And then when I was coming back on our way, you can see children are running, going back home. And they walk, like somebody mentioned that, walk long distance. I think Professor Julia mentioned that they walk long distance. And that's a major problem. Sometimes rain starts and then everything is soaked, and then you go home, everything is messed up. You have to think about buying new school material, and that's not good. So infrastructure is very important, whether roads and bridges, and also schools closer to where children live. That's very important. That actually will allow students to be motivated to go to school and come back and learn. And that's very important. And another thing that also need to be emphasized is the parental involvement in the children's education, because you can improve, and this goes back to the family. The parent must be available in the life of their children. Like when we are growing up, our parents, although they are not always on our neck, but they always encourage you to go to school, to go to school, to go to school. So parental involvement is very important in the children's lives, because so that you can follow what's happening in the school and the progress of your child actually in the school. And that's very important, something that needs to be introduced into South Sudan. And I think it's happening in some schools, maybe in South Sudan. Julia can speak to that. So that's generally what I can say based on this question. And yeah, and that's why people are doing well in many parts of the United States and also in Canada in terms of the public school system. And it doesn't mean that there are no private schools in the US. There are private schools. They have like charter schools, and that one also varies from one state to another. The charter schools is the schools that where parents can choose where they want to take their children, and there's some payment of school fees in that regards. And even some of the charter schools actually use public school facilities actually to run those schools, particularly in New York City, because I teach in New York City. They have like the same building, it has both public school and then charter school as well. So that also varies from one state to another in that regard. So I can stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kane. I think it's also, again, still funding is one issue, infrastructure, public transportation to be able to carry the children from one position to another, and having schools also in the vicinity of where the children live to be able to access them. So thank you so much. And that takes me to Dr. Julia on the question of, is political environment and political will affecting the education sector in South Sudan? I've already heard from Dr. Kani now how also the political will and public funding can change the situation in regards to education sector, making it better for the students. But how can this situation be changed in the case of South Sudan if there's no political will to be able to improve the reform of education? Dr. Julia, I think she's frozen. Okay. Yeah. I'll move on to Evelyn. Yeah. You've already mentioned, Evelyn, in regards to the decent and timely payment for teachers and lecturers to be able to improve the education sector in South Sudan. If you have more examples or relevant input on that, so please go on. Or you can go also further to the next question where we asked you about what possible challenges do you think face us now in regards to reforming the education sector. I've already had a lot of them, but if there are some that have not been touched, so please go on and mention some. Evelyn has also disappeared. Yeah. Okay.
And that's another infrastructure that needs to be developed in South Sudan as well. The internet connection in South Sudan needs to be developed as well.
Definitely. Yeah, you can imagine students sitting and having lectures and the internet breaking up. So that's another challenge. Regina, you had mentioned already in regards to the students and how they are making a conducive environment for them. The question that we have for you is in regards to how poverty and economic hardship contribute to poor quality of education, and especially in regards to South Sudan. Being a teacher, you might have met students with economical problems coming from families that have financial problems, and that possibly affects their education. So if you could please highlight on that. Please unmute yourself. We can't hear you.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. Yes, poverty, and the panelists have touched on that too. Poverty and economic hardship contribute to, of course, accessing poor or quality education, or none, like in our situation in South Sudan. Of course, lack of funding will contribute to not having a school, and teachers at school not having had the training needed to help children learn effectively. The world's most vulnerable children from disadvantaged communities, including young girls and children with disabilities, are more likely to miss out on school, especially on those countries. It's too bad that we are like, especially when it's coming to girls' education, are we behind, or we, and then with Afghanistan and these countries, yes, in South Sudan. So children need the right environment to learn, as I mentioned in the beginning, but that cannot happen if we have, even in the schools that we have like 70 students in one class. That will be too big. What I'm saying for now, we don't need to have fancy classroom. Maybe in the future we can have fancy classroom, but at least we have a classroom that is decent enough to have a student. We need also, and all of these things are not happening because of poverty and because of not having stability, because of broken infrastructure, because everything is tied together, the road, the distance that children go to, the poverty. That means children sometimes walk and go to school hungry. They don't have food, and you can learn when you are not like somebody mentioned earlier. That's for the teachers as well. That's for many people in South Sudan. Also, poverty means you have poor sanitation in school, lack of toilets. This is very important. We need that also for girls. And sometimes that can be discouraging to go to school with not having like clean toilets, and also not having sanitation products. And especially when girls start to have their period, they need to manage their period with pride and dignity. If you don't have that, and I think that will go to the tie to the question of also encouraging girls to go to school. And all these things, we lack them because of poverty, lack of learning material, textbooks. Somebody talk about like outdated textbooks, or they are worn out, workbooks, exercise book, readers, teachers. We need to have a lot of teachers being trained, teachers and educational assistant, so they can help with larger classroom. So I will give example here in I think in Canada, in the US, and all these other countries. So like we have teachers that are hired and work in school, and they hire more teachers as substitute teachers because things happen and there is a lot of stress in teaching. So if teacher is sick, or even if they are overwhelmed, they take a day off. Some teacher will take their place as a substitute teacher. And I have done that too, where you go to different school. I don't have, the teacher will leave the plan for me, for example, and then I will start to teach. So all these things are, we can be able to achieve these things if there is funding, there is resources, the government, the communities, the NGOs, the private sectors, and people who are in South Sudan, and I don't want to talk politics, like what's the word, accumulating wealth, and they are not giving back to communities, and they are not paying taxes. And that's taxes we use to fund the school. So poverty is linked also to everything in South Sudan. It's not just the school, that we don't have schools, we don't have teachers, we don't have hospitals. It's only few who send their kids. And we said, I live in Canada. My son has had a good education because I live here. Unfortunately, that's not the case with many people in South Sudan. So living in a country at a conflict of risk, that also can cause poverty and hunger, poor nutrition. School should be free. Public school should be free in South Sudan. So money shouldn't be an issue. I believe that, and I'm sure all of you here believe in that. Education is a right. It's not a privilege for the few, and and every child in South Sudan deserves to have a good education. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And just got a comment on how security is also so important in all this, because without security, without stability, we won't be able to have all these reforms in place. So that's a good reminder. Thank you so much. I'll move further to Dr. Kane. I think now we just go on to the recommendations. So moving forward, we have had lots of challenges that we face as a nation in regards to reforming our education sector, but we have some recommendations that might help in building up the system and reforming already the systems that are in place. So please go on, Dr. Akane, and give us some recommendations moving forward.
Thank you, Dora. Before I go to my recommendation, I just want to add to what Regina just mentioned in terms of improving the the school system in terms of poverty. And I think it's important that in South Sudan, they need to think about providing food for children at school. Because here in the US, they assess the students' income based on their income. If your income is low, then you are either eligible for free breakfast or free lunch or both. Yeah, so that's very important if we really want to improve the educational system and the education of our children in South Sudan. At least they have to consider providing food for children who cannot afford to buy lunch for themselves or to buy breakfast. The other thing is also she touched on the special needs situation of children who have special needs. And I think also if schools in South Sudan can provide special education for the children who has special needs is very important. Whether that's the physical or learning needs actually is very important for our children so that we've built an equitable society where we don't discriminate against people who have special needs because that's what's happening now in South Sudan where people look down at those who have special needs whether it's physical or other kind of need and you mentioned something about sanitary part that's very important and I think the schools in South Sudan need to start introducing uh, creating awareness among young girls in schools, particularly when they're progressing towards their poverty period, so that they learn how to handle actually the sanitary pads. And I think many parents here in the US, for example, when children reaches the age of at level like fifth grade, fourth and fifth grade, for example, they start inviting parents actually to talk about the changes that are going to happen to their children in their bodies and the way they look and the menstrual period, how they can use the pad. And that's very important because when we're growing up, we're not taught that. Our parents didn't come to school to help us and listen to the instructors at school. For the recommendation, actually, what I'm going to say is that any reform in the educational sector requires a safe environment. At the moment, there is no safe environment in South Sudan. So to have that change in the educational system, South Sudan needs a genuine and sustainable peace and political stability. That's very important to be able to build public institutions. And these institutions can be political institutions like governmental buildings, for example, educational, economic, and social cultural institutions that are necessary for the betterment of South Sudan and its people. Because without those institutions, without security, without stability, people will not be able to actually learn and live a better life. Because you can't live. What's going on in South Sudan is not acceptable for our next generation. You know, any change or reform in South Sudan actually requires also leaders who have the interests of South Sudan in their heart. You know, uh, and who are actually capable of transforming South Sudan to a country that respects and value the rights and dignity of everyone, whether that person is a child, that person is a female, or a male. At least we need people who respect the dignity of South Sudanese people. And also, uh, we need actually new leadership. And that new leadership actually is a prerequisite for any comprehensive educational reforms and overall transformation of South Sudan. Because without that, I just feel sorry for our country, you know. I love South Sudan and I wish I can go back like every year, like the other faculty who are teaching in the West, for example. Like my supervisor used to go back every year to Ghana. He's a Ghanaian professor at University of Toronto. So every year he goes back and teach in the summer. So we need that environment so that we will be able to go back also and contribute, because we are a product of that country. That country invested on us, but now we are not actually giving back to South Sudan. We are actually teaching outside. Regina is teaching in Canada. I'm teaching in the United States. Evelyn is teaching in Uganda. So we need that.
Thank you
So
so much.
that's what I can say in
Mm.
general.
Thank you so much for great recommendation. I think I'll move further to Dr. Julia. Would you please give us your final recommendations moving forward?
Thank you very much. I have been having a lot of problems in and out with the internet. We talk about recommendation, and there was too much echo, so I couldn't follow up the discussion very well. And if we are in part of the recommendation, I will start first with the nation building. If the country is not really a viable country, all these things we are talking about will be will not be able to be implemented. In nation building, you have four pillars that will build a nation. And the first one is really the security, so that the country can be able to be secure physically to the citizen as well as the whole country. Property security. The second is mobilization of resources. You evaluate your resources, you mobilize them so that those resources now can be able to address the challenges we are challenges are what
Again, the internet issue.
is investing in
Yeah, I think I'll go back to you, Regina, to give us your final recommendation moving forward.
Okay, thank you again. South Sudan is obviously, as you all said, or we agree, have many challenges in every sector, not education alone, but it goes back to the issue of security, as you said. I hope we are restoring peace and stability, that we will make education free for every child. As I said before, it's a right, not a privilege. We make education inclusive in terms of gender, in terms of ability, in terms of poverty, in terms of rural versus, or our society mainly it's rural, to be honest. But what I mean, to have, we don't have to make people travel to come and get education, but let's have schools in their places, in their villages, and that will happen when there is security, there is stability, there is peace, and everybody is doing their job, and everybody is doing their job. Sorry. Okay. So at least having the other thing also, we need to have schools and have training for teachers, including special education training. Training is school teachers for primary school, for kindergarten, for middle and high school. So We need to have a lot of teachers. We need to do training in that, make resources available for students and teachers, alleviate poverty, hunger for students, training teachers in every field, establishing, I mentioned that already. South Sudan should make education a priority and start with the ABCs. I would like to end with the quote from Rita Pearson's that I start in the beginning, and in which she says, every child deserves a champion, an adult who will never give up on them, who understand the power of connection and insist they become the best they can be. And that adult, whether it's the government, whether it's the community, whether it's the society, whether it's the schools or the family, we all need to work together to give child of South Sudan, a girl of South Sudan, that opportunity of education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina, for great recommendation. Evelyn is having problems with the internet, but she has sent her recommendation, and that is, her recommendation is that we need to change or diversify our curriculum. We need to level up our standard of public school to the standard of private school, and that we also, she recommends the encompassing of the curriculum, that government needs to invest more in public schools so that we can have our children that go on the same private schools will have the same standard, like at least good standard from the public school. So thank you so much for the recommendation. Dr. Kuyang has dropped off because of the internet, and the same with Dr. Julia. So we'll just conclude by saying that to help ensure that reform happens, or the reform that we have mentioned happens, we need community support for education is very essential. We need parents to support their children going to school and encourage them to stay at school, because such support is not easy to sustain in the face of instability that our country is facing now, and due to the changing social priorities as well. Therefore, informed and determined political leadership is very important at every level and in every sector. The government, business, labor, and education is crucial for achieving the reforms that we have mentioned. Without such leadership, community support for education reform will fade away long before its lasting results can be achieved. So thank you so much, all the panelists, for your great insights into this topic. We've really learned a lot. Thank you, the audience, for tuning in and staying with us, though we had some technical problems. And we thank the UN office for their support throughout our discussions, our weekly discussions. And we thank you, Aisha, for being patient with us and helping us with the technicals. And may you all have a blessed week, and see you again next Saturday when we'll have the next discussion. So thank you so much. Bye for now.
Thank you.